I'm going to talk about an issue that is rather excluded from the ongoing drama in the Middle East, and that's the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, which I see as a key. Its resolution is key to resolving some of this chaos. Indeed, not since the end of World War I have we seen such chaos in the Middle East, such horrific mess. The Western powers at that time carved up the defeated Ottoman Empire into states, monarchies for Iraq, Egypt, and the never-before state of Transjordan, while several, Lebanon, Syria, and Palestine, were placed under UN mandates, which really were putting them under colonialism for 20-odd years. But their charge from the UN was to prepare them for democratic independence, which didn't happen, as we know. The area was largely Muslim, but ethnically quite diverse, where different peoples, Christians, Muslims, Jews, and others coexisted with relative peace. Now, 100 years later, the area has become a violent, chaotic mess, increasingly characterized by sectarian strife, which is being encouraged politically. Libya, Iraq, Syria are disintegrating in the face of the expanding Islamic State that came into being in 2006, it's important to remember, in response to the catastrophic invasion of Iraq by the United States. Into this mess, the Palestinian-Israeli conflict remains among the historical causes of this current instability, and I believe is a crucial part of its resolution. As Professor Vijay Prajad says, Palestinians are the greatest uniters of people in the Arab world. Whatever differences people may have within Egypt, in Iraq, in Syria, Libya, they continue to be united in their identification with the suffering of Palestinians. It's a very powerful unification experience. The suffering of Palestinians, their ethnic cleansing and dispossession by Zionist Israel's creation in 1948, Israel's refusal to allow millions of refugees to return home, the ongoing illegal military occupation of the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, the siege of Gaza, illegal Jewish-only settler colonies. Now there are 600,000 colonists there in the occupied territories. And, aghast at the apartheid within Israel for its own Palestinian citizens and in the occupied territories against people who are not Jews. Indeed, the insertion of Zionism and its rejection and literal ejection of non-Jews in historic Palestine set the course for disastrous policies in the Middle East. I remind you again that Jews had lived in Middle Eastern countries for many, many years in relative peace and harmony. There were no Jewish holocausts in the Middle East. But Zionism's racist policies and its policing role for Western control of oil in the Middle East has become a chronic source of violence. The 1967 war, the 1973 war, the invasions of Lebanon, we could go on and on. So I have two main points that I want to make here now. First, that this unresolved Palestinian-Israeli conflict has been a useful tool by tyrannical Arab governments like Egypt, Syria, and Saudi Arabia to deflect attention from their own oppressive and undemocratic policies. With massive support by the United States to maintain the security of the State of Israel, these governments over time have been persuaded by military aid to support Israel at the UN or Egypt's current maintenance of a blockade against Gaza, and to suppress their own people, again, with these armaments. In fact, this conflict is a linchpin around which these regimes have long operated. As Egypt's revolution began in 2011, James Jones, then the former commander of all native forces and former national security advisor for President Obama, said in 2011 at a Herzliya conference in Israel that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, quote, is the knot that is at the center of the mass of all regional and most global diplomatic problems today. That's quite an impressive thing to accuse the conflict of being responsible for. And though often unnoticed by Western media, when the Arab Spring erupted in Tunisia and Egypt in 2011, many participants in those demonstrations and in the protests acknowledged that sustained Palestinian resistance to Israel were inspirations in their own uprising against Hosni Mubarak. The Egyptian revolution, rather than coming out of the blue in 2011, was a result of a process that had been brewing over the previous decade. A chain reaction, actually, to the autumn 2000 protests in solidarity with the Second Palestinian Intifada, the uprising then. During the demonstrations in Tahrir Square, one could see Egyptian flags hung over posters that said, "Free Palestine." So only after the Palestinian Intifada broke out in September 2000 did tens of thousands of Egyptians take to the streets in protest, probably for the first time since 1977. Although these demonstrations were in solidarity with Palestinians, they soon gained an anti-regime dimension, and police began to stop these, what were then peaceful protests. So this began a decade ago with the inspiration of Palestinians. So I'm trying to emphasize to you how much the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, what it means to people in the Middle East. So Palestinian samud, or steadfastness, in the face of oppression has been a constant reminder for resistance to tyranny throughout the Middle East. With that said, to justly solve this conflict would be a crucial step towards bringing peace to that region. And as things are now, there's just no attention to trying to do that. The position that I'm going to speak about, the position of the Green Party of the United States, is that forming one democratic state in Israel-Palestine, from the Mediterranean to the River Jordan, is the only way that there can be a just peace there, but also this could have a very positive influence on the region. To that end, we must first acknowledge that the two-state solution is dead. It just doesn't exist. It's been a chimera. It's been a way for 20 years, especially since the so-called peace process began, to provide cover for Israel to seize more Palestinian land. The reality is that the West Bank has been integrated into Israel demographically and economically. The orgy of settlement building, ironically, has encouraged any possibility of a two-state solution. As the former mayor of Jerusalem, Marin Benvenisti, says, the situation now is that it is one de facto state with one people, the Israeli Jews, in control of another, but it's become, as he says, an egg that cannot be unscrambled. It's so tight now. Moreover, Israel has no intention of creating two states. As you all know, just in the recent election of Netanyahu, he said publicly he's opposed to any two-state solution. He kind of backpedaled that for public consumption here, but that's been the position of Likud all along. I mean, when you look at some of the statements from people in his cabinet, Netanyahu said, "I think anyone who's going to establish a Palestinian state and to evacuate territory is giving radical Islam a staging ground against the state of Israel." That's what he thinks about it, two states. Naftali Bennett, his Minister of Education, says, "I will do everything in my power to make sure the Palestinians never get a state." That's in The New Yorker, that was published. These are all statements in, fairly significant media. Ayat Shakad, Minister of Justice, said, "We should manage the conflict and not give up on any centimeter of land. Yes, it's not perfect, but it's better than any other alternative." And Moshe Ya'alon, Minister of Defense, said, "It's time to free ourselves of the concept that everything leads to a framework that is called a state. From my standpoint, they can call it the Palestinian Empire. I don't care. There's no state." And finally, Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs, Zippy Hotovli, said, "This land is ours. All of it is ours. We expect a matter of principle of the international community to recognize Israel's right to build homes for Jews in their homeland everywhere." That was in The Guardian. And in truth, there's no difference between the Labor governments before. They would just kind of paint it as if there was really going to be a state, but their actions were entirely opposite that by seizing more land over this 20-plus year period since the Oslo Accords. The other thing that's wrong with a two-state solution is that you cannot reconcile that with the right of Palestinians to return home. There's simply no room for the 4 or 5 million Palestinians, should they choose, to come back to a little, Bantustan statelet, which is what is proposed. Moreover, there'd be increasing environmental degradation of the land. Right now, Israel controls 80% of the water that's under the aquifers in the West Bank for Israel. As Joel Cavell has described in Overcoming Zionism, the ongoing environmental disaster resulting from Israeli efforts to maintain a Jewish state by dispossessing Palestinians will only worsen given the structural inequality between them. And this brings us to addressing the heart of the conflict itself, that Israel is a Zionist state. Unlike any other state in the world, Israel describes itself as the state of all Jews everywhere, not the state of its citizens. Thus, under law, Israel has institutionalized privilege of Jews over non-Jews. And like South Africa and the Jim Crow U.S., this institutionalized racism is apartheid. So that's where we stand. There's no two-state solution. One state is really the only way that sees any promise in this whole region. One state would have many advantages. It would observe international law, especially with regard to illegal settlements, refugee rights, apartheid practices, and the self-determination of both peoples, not the self-determination of one at the expense of the others, as it is now. This one state would transform Israel's increasingly pariah status as a racist country and allow its Jewish citizens to feel at home in its actual neighborhood, the Middle East. It would contribute to peace and security in this terribly violent region, potentially as a model of a diverse and equal citizenry. Indeed, one state would reflect the actual multiculturalism that has always defined Israel-Palestine or historic Palestine and the whole region. It would be the homeland for two peoples. Moreover, Zionist Israel is not really Jewish, in my view, and in the view of many Jews who support one democratic state, in that its racist policies towards Palestinians defy Jewish values of seeking justice and of having compassion for human suffering. And finally, one democratic state is increasingly supported by Palestinians and by some Israeli Jews and of late Americans. For example, this is a very impressive poll. In December of 2014, a survey of Americans, about 1,200 of them by the Brookings Institute, not a particularly leftist organization, when asked about their preferred solution to the conflict, 34% said they wanted one democratic state, which was up from 24% a year before, and 39% supported two states. Significantly, when asked if the two-state solution were not possible, which I'm suggesting it is not possible, it's a sham, a whopping 71% of Americans polled favored one state in which Palestinians and Jews were equal over a state where a Jewish majority were sustained and Jews were privileged over Palestinian citizens. Of those favoring this one democratic state option, where putting aside the two states were not okay, and you had equality, of those people, 84% were registered Democrats. Now, here's the problem that Lenny will go into further in terms of an upcoming election. 84% of the people, at least in this poll, said they would support this, except that the Democratic Party platform supports the two-state solution, which does nothing to bring about, but does everything to undermine that, like giving money that goes to settlements, etc., and supporting Israel's violation of human rights. And then the Republican Party platform has done the same in the past, but of late it has really backpedaled and doesn't want to constrain Israel from whatever it needs. So it's not clear what any Republican presidential candidate would actually be advocating. Sadly, what about progressive Democratic Socialist candidate Bernie Sanders, who seeks the Democratic nomination? He's right along there with the Dems, including, as Juan Cole says, Bernie gave a yeoman's defense of Israel's assaults on Gaza, which in 2014 killed 2,000 people, including 500 children. And Bernie focuses on Israel being very vulnerable to the Islamic State, which seems rather weird, given that Israel is, the fourth largest military in the world, has nuclear weapons, which it has threatened to use in the past and was, pulled from the brink. So then again, we have the Green Party, whose platform since 2010 has been in support of the one democratic state. Since 2005 has supported the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement as a nonviolent way to get Israel to negotiate. So considering these foreign policy stances of these different parties, I'm asking you, whom will you vote for in 2016? That's all I have to say. Thank you.